posted publicly. So yeah, if you're not okay with your audio or video being recorded, now's the time to get out. Cool. We have, I think, sort of going through through our 2 drop assets that we have in the process, but just in general, sort of thinking about how we can bring real-world assets on Maker, the sort of using our tech. I think there's a few interesting topics we can go into and sort of tack on to what we've been working on and talking about in the risk call last week. And maybe just to give a brief overview to everyone, sort of how these assets work. I'll just explain trying to put it very simply how what Tinlake is. Our goal is to allow an asset originator to give fixed interest loans, mostly short-term loans, to different borrowers. These loans are then put into a portfolio against which 2 tokens are minted, the TIN and the drop token. The TIN token represents a junior tranche. That means that TIN token holders sort of take first loss and have a potentially higher yield, but more risk. The drop token holders are guaranteed a fixed interest, fixed return, and only take losses if the TIN tranche has been completely wiped out. So the drop token, the 2 primary users for these 2 different tokens is that the TIN token is generally held by the asset originators, and anyone that wants to sort of have this very leveraged exposure to the asset. And the drop token is sort of the more stable asset used for example with Maker and just other investors, sort of the more scalable token. The drop token itself is implemented as a yield or an interest-bearing token. So Tinlake allows an investor to supply DAI and get drop token minted at the current exchange rate. Interest accrues over time, and they can then redeem their drop tokens for DAI at the increased rate. And so we're now, I think the goal would be today to talk about how we can sort of fit that into using Maker as a liquidity provider for these loans. Maybe like one aspect that we need to bring up in the beginning that I thought would be interesting to bring up in the beginning is just how we within Tinlake use a NAV model to price what this entire portfolio of loans is worth. Within Tinlake we have this need to value the entire portfolio. The way this is done is by using a discounted cash flow model to sort of model out the expected revenue on these different loans based on their risk score, look at certain default risks and factor that in, and then at the end ultimately arrive at a value of this overall portfolio. We take that value and use that to make sure that the TIN token that the value of the overall TIN token overall portfolio is worth the what the TIN token holders plus drop token holders have in debt outstanding. And so we can go from to make an example, we have 100 different loans. this NAV model reports that these 100 loans amount to 150,000 DAI. The current debt outstanding of the drop token is 125, which means that the leftover value that can be given to the TIN token holders is 25,000 DAI. So if we were to if this TIN Lake pool was configured to have a 10% minimum TIN ratio, so 10% of 150 would be 15. So we now know that because the drop debt of this 150,000 DAI portfolio is only 125,000 DAI, we know that this ratio is intact. So this means that we sort of have guaranteed this underlying insurance that we need to give, that at least 10% of the portfolio is being held by TIN token holders. So this is sort of the first layer we have, and now I think where I'd like to go next is just how do we get to adding drop to maker? What do we think about pricing them? How could we use the NAV model that we rely on to determine what the TIN and the drop is worth as a way that can influence the maker system itself, and what should be the parameters that we want to give to the vault for accepting this kind of collateral. So if going from this, and please do interrupt me if there are any questions. With this system, how it works is we allow. I talked about how investors can supply and redeem this. Like basically, an investor can supply DAI to put into this TIN Lake pool, and they get drop in return, or they get TIN in return, depending on which tranche they'd like to invest. And if they want to exit their position, they can go to the TIN Lake contracts and say they want to redeem their token, which would mean that TIN Lake would now, instead of allowing the asset originator to reinvest the DAI that's being repaid by the borrowers, it would take these cash flows and give them to the different parties that want to redeem their, or sort of redeem their position, to redeem their drop or TIN. When this happens, again, we need to guarantee that first of all, we issue the tokens at the right price, or we redeem the tokens at the right price. For the drop token, this is relatively simple. We just say it's the current value with per second compounding for ever increasing. For the TIN token, this depends on, of course, what the actual portfolio performance has been. If there have been losses and the value of the TIN shrinks, if the portfolio has outperformed the initial expectations, then the TIN token becomes worth more. How we can calculate that and determine that is based on what the NAV model actually tells us. So to use that example of these 150,000 DAI worth of loans outstanding, if we have an average interest rate over this portfolio of 10%, and the drop token holders were promised a 7% yield, there's this 3% that's left that will go to the TIN token holders, or 3% of the left over the entire portfolio. So that money will go into the TIN pool. The NAV model takes sort of these calculations into account, and at the end arrives at the value of the overall portfolio. can tell us if at what the current price of tin is, considering these different assets, considering these different loans, their performance, and their expected cash flow in the future. On a continuous basis, the Tinlake contracts then allow these investors to redeem at this price. Tin token holders can redeem if the asset, if the value of the portfolio is, if the amount of tin in the portfolio, the percentage of tin is higher than the percentage. So in the example I made with 125,000 in drop and 25,000 in tin, you could actually, the tin token holders could exit up to the point where, and now is where my math gets a bit too complicated to do it in the head, but up to the point where you now had a portfolio that was worth roughly 125,000 drop and roughly 12,000 tin, 12,000 DAI worth of tin. So the portfolio could go from 150 to 137 DAI. If drop token holders wanted to redeem, they can redeem at any point in time, and drop cash loan cash flows would be used to sort of make these redemptions. Alternatively, if you have a situation where new drop holders want to invest, old ones want to exit, then of course you can also swap one investor out for another. So this rebalancing in sort of the traditional financial world is done by the fund manager, oftentimes on like a monthly basis, where quite literally they would pick up the phone and ask every single LP of this credit fund, are you interested in topping up? Do you want to get any capital out of your investment? And then this rebalancing is done on a best effort. In Tinlake, we do this with contracts, with smart contracts. Obviously, we don't want to have a fund manager that can control this or censor. So what we do is we, over a period of, for example, say 24 hours, we collect these different requests. At the end, we settle. We sort of add all of the supply, add up everyone that adds, take out everyone that wants to redeem. If there is not enough, if there's not enough money to redeem, then everyone would just get a proportional amount back until more loans are repaid, at which point there would be additional cash that could be given back and sort of to be able to fulfill that. So here you can talk about a few different scenarios that happen, that can happen in this. So for example, in the good case, where this portfolio is interesting and more investors want to invest and the asset originator actually has a need for more capital, drop token holders can just supply more capital, and therefore the pool can grow. If an individual drop token holder wants to exit the individual drop token holder wants to exit their position, then and there's enough supply, there's enough interest from other investors that want to up their stake, their position, that can just simply be swapped. If if no one else wants to invest, but say loans are being repaid on a regular basis, right? So there's cash coming in, then what it would mean is just that the portfolio would shrink by the amount that the investor wants to take out, until someone else wants to add again. In the sort of worst case scenario where there's not enough liquidity available so that an investor can exit their entire position, or like the absolute worst case, there's all investors want to get out. What would happen is that because there's always more demand for investor withdrawals, no loans can be originated, no new loans can be originated. So sort of this fund is what people call burn down, goes into burn down mode, where now all of the ongoing loans are being repaid by the borrowers, and that cash is directly going into proportionally split up into the investors that put up a claim for redeeming their drop or TIN. So how many people have I lost? Maybe we should do quick questions or comments.
All right, I'll maybe say something that you may have covered this a little bit, but I was getting message and things like, can you sort of just in a very simple way say, like, in what cases is DAI minted from the protocol, right? Like what is the situation in which that happens, right? It's when yeah, again, it's kind of fuzzy on like the kind of how it goes from the whole loan originators and the drop in TIN tokens into minting DAI, right? Can you like
Yeah.
just is that sort of easily explainable in like a sentence or like a paragraph or something?
Yeah, I can. So I've left MCD and the system out for now, just sort of because I wanted to show how it works just with any arbitrary person or entity or smart contract interacting with the system. But and I'll explain it first in this, and then we can maybe go into how this can be made to work with Maker. So for what we're talking about is, okay, we want to borrow money. The first thing that we need for this TIN-like pool to be able to do is, so we start by actually creating this pool. We say, for example, console freight and paper chain create this pool with the following characteristics. There's a 10% TIN ratio. So that means for 100 DAI in loans outstanding, there needs to be at least 10 DAI in capital supplied by TIN. They also say that they will give the drop token holders a fixed yield of, for example, 7%. So the pool is created with that, and that's fixed. So the system always ensures that there's a 10% TIN, and there is, and the senior always has a claim on any cash that comes in up to the 7% fixed interest on their investment. So now at day zero, there's 0 DAI in TIN Lake. There's 0 loans outstanding, and we want to sort of originate our first loan. What we do is, the first thing that needs to happen is actually the TIN investor needs to invest first, because without TIN, you cannot have, without any TIN being there, you cannot have any drop invest, right? Because otherwise you'd break this 10% ratio. So so what will happen is, let's say the asset originator puts up 10,000 DAI in TIN. So now the system has some TIN outstanding, and there's 10,000 DAI in the system, and now NSPL, can you mute yourself? Let me see. So now the system can actually start originating loans. With these 10,000 DAI, we can add three loans, $3,000 each, 3,000 DAI each. So they're now actually, so now what happens is the system has an internal balance of 0 DAI. It has 10,000 DAI in loans outstanding and 10,000 invested by TIN. So now we actually have 100% current TIN ratio. We can go and we can mint, we can mint drop token and sell it such that the drop outstanding would be 9,000 DAI in debt, and TIN's current investment then goes to sort of, and so now we sell the drop, and we now have $10,000 worth of loans, $10,000 invested by TIN, $9,000 or DAI invested by drop holders. So now there's actually 9,000 DAI again of liquidity in the system that can be again used to originate new loans. And so this can happen until we've grown this portfolio to and reinvested all of the TIN that all of the DAI that the TIN holder supplied. And so in the end, with the 10,000 DAI investment by the TIN holders, we can mint up to 90,000 DAI. Sorry, 90,000 DAI worth of drop. And so that can then be given to investors. And so that continuously happens as the portfolio grows, and the NFTs loans get added. And then sort of once you've built up your portfolio, then of course, as repayments are made, you can either have drop holders redeem their token for DAI to get out of it, or you can just reinvest it and maintain your portfolio. And so then that's where the NAV the NAV calculation comes in, is because you then you need a way to price this asset and know, is the 10%, is that still guaranteed? What is the value of the TIN token if you wanted to have, if you now have reached this 100,000 in total portfolio size, and you wanted to actually double the size, then TIN investors would need to put in another 10,000 DAI, so that you could then grow the pool to 200,000. And so that's sort of how it works. Now for, is that clear, roughly long?
Yeah, I think I'm following
Okay, cool.
so far. I still don't really see where Maker fits in, right? Because
yeah,
you've kind of got all the loans and things happening outside of Maker so far.
Yeah, so far everything's happening outside of Maker, right? But what we want to get to is we want to get this drop actually to be put into a vault, and the DAI being minted by Maker. And so the way that this can happen is by, instead of an investor being you or me or whoever else, when we still have the TIN token holders, the asset originator, maybe some other investors, put up the initial amount of capital to start this portfolio. And as we then start adding new loans, and as we grow the value of this portfolio, now you can start issuing drop, and you can, instead of going and giving it to an end user, you can give it to a vault, and you can draw DAI against this drop. And so the idea is that we could actually build an adapter that would maintain a vault, and instead of having selling these drop on a market or issuing it directly to investors, you can deposit them in the vault and draw DAI. And now Maker holds drop tokens, the vault holds drop tokens that appreciate in interest, and as long as our NAV model says that these loans are worth what they're supposed to be, defaults are not going up, the credit risk of these loans is not changing, which is all data that would that would be provided by oracles and feed into the model that calculates the NAV on chain, right? So we go from these individual loans with a risk score and a value and a maturity date on all of them, and we calculate what this portfolio is worth. So we go from that to then what is the drop, what is the value of the drop. If the portfolio is worth more than what the drop debt is, then if you were to liquidate this portfolio today, according to this model, you would actually you'd actually have some money left over for TIN at the end. So it is still collateralized, over collateralized from the drop holder's perspective. And so sort of you can look at this NAV model and see, okay, if defaults are increasing or the credit risk is deteriorating, or the credit worthiness is deteriorating, such that now the loan portfolio is starting to be worth less and less and less. We initially had a 200,000 DAI portfolio of loans in there, according to what our NAV model is saying. Perhaps the economic circumstances, or who knows what, or just defaults that already happened, right? Economic circumstances devaluing outstanding loans because their credit risk is going up, or just defaults happening. You now have suddenly your portfolio is worth 190,000. You would actually, technically, you would still be safe from a drop holder's perspective, because the drop token debt is 180,000 DAI, and the TIN token holders at that point would have lost half of their capital, because they supplied 20 initially and now would only get 10,000 back. And I'm not factoring in interest rates right now, but just to keep the numbers simple. But so presumably from a drop token holder's perspective, it would still be fine. From a TIN token holder's perspective, you've taken a 50% loss. Now, if it gets worse, and you go below the 180,000, that's where, as a drop token holder, you know that even if all of the remaining loans are being paid back as expected by the model, there's not enough value left for TIN to be to pay back the return it guarantees. And so in that instance,
can I ask you a question about
yeah,
this mechanism with
yeah,
the DAI coming from a CDP? So can we view it like this? Like, let's say that this pool, which is the one that's issuing the fund or whatever that's issuing the TIN and the drop tokens. Let's say simply the drop was, an allowed collateral type in Maker. Just in terms of ownership, like in terms of who owns the CDP and where, like who is entitled to what, can we think of it as the pool having the facility to open a CDP, and then instead of usually the pool mints drop tokens in response to a DAI deposit, right? In this case, it does it kind of the other way around. So it actually makes those drop tokens first, puts them in the CDP, and then takes DAI out to fund them. Does this give you the outcome that you want?
Yeah.
So then essentially the pool owns a CDP that has drop tokens in it as collateral, and the DAI that came out of that CDP was used to fund the drop tokens themselves.
Yeah. So I mean, really, as long as we can make that work within, I mean, we have a model where we can plug different adapters into both the senior and the junior tranche that we can use to issue and to have like these redemption and supply function, the redemption and supply actions happening. So what the intention is to build an adapter that would mint the drop token, deposit it into the gem join adapter, draw the DAI or create the debt, draw the DAI, take it out with the adapter and deposit it, and that can be done in one transaction. So yes, that would be like the ideal scenario, right? With that, we achieve that sort of, provided the TIN token holders have provided enough insurance in form of like TIN investment, and the NAV model reports a good, like the price oracles or the risk and price oracles that feed the NAV model, and then the NAV model itself reports an appropriate value, then you can have the situation where instantly we can generate the DAI we need to originate new loans as necessary.
So sorry, can I just interrupt? So if I understand this correctly, the advantage to that is that you then don't need outside drop investors to originate new loans. You can use the
Exactly.
protocol instead.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So in that case, it's kind of like the protocol's doing the investment in drop. Then in that case, isn't it?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. I think that helps me understand it a lot better than I did before. So thank you.
So we save ourselves, right, having to sell these drop tokens on the market and then hope that or have someone else that would be then buying the drop token, leveraging using Maker, so depositing it into a vault, which would be the other thing that could happen, right? Like we could also design this integration in a different way, and I really I'm open to sort of exploring both scenarios. We could also design the system so that Tinlake would only sell drop tokens in one way, meaning directly in exchange for DAI, and then someone else that could still be the asset originator, but like in a second step, you would take the drop token, you would deposit it in a vault, get DAI, and then maybe do the same thing again.
Yeah, use that.
But yeah,
So
then
either leverage up on drop or do something else. Okay.
Yeah.
So in that model, it would be similar to in that model it would be similar to the current assets we use, right? Like anyone can just buy the asset and then although this is whitelisted, I think, right, or something KYC'd. Right?
You'd need to be KYC'd, but
Sure.
you could, yeah. So I think though it's ultimately like it could be something that we could build, but I think the much more elegant solution would be if we figure out a way that, as you described it, Lev, the Tinlake pool actually holds the vault and is using that as a as a first source of capital, not sort of on a secondary market.
So I'm glad you mentioned the second model. So in the second model, I think the accounting is actually very clear. So firstly, it's similar to how existing CDPs work in Maker, and secondly, I think when you work it out, you discover that then there's basically 3 tranches in this venture, right? So you have the most junior ones is Tin, and then you have this you have Drop, and then you kind of also have Maker playing this role of providing loans against Drop collateral, which is senior to holding to holding Drop in a CDP, right? Because Maker always has the first name on your collateral. But in the previous model, where the CDP is where the DAI is issued directly, I'm not sure how to get the accounting to work out, because there, if we did it literally like I said, you have to put in DAI basically at the the par value of Drop in order to mint Drop. So I don't know, in your example there it was supposed to be 1-to-1, like I have to put in 1 DAI to get 1 Drop or whatever, but let's say it was. So in that case, you have Maker having the CDP having to issue 100 DAI in order to be able to properly fund 100 Drop. So it seems like then the LTV is like 100%, which means that Maker doesn't actually have the same senior position that it does in the second scheme, where you have some third party who's using the CDP basically for leverage, and actually in practice it's possible as a result for most of the capital to actually come from Maker anyway, if the leverage is high enough. But those seem to be qualitatively different because of that. So I'm not sure how we fix this first model.
Does it require 100%? I'm not sure I follow why that's the case, because
just very simply, what I'm saying is that, so let's say you have to put in 1 DAI to get 1 Drop, right? And let's say we want basically the pool itself to open the CDP to get the DAI in order to make its own Drop, right? So if it wants to create 100 Drop, it needs to borrow 100 DAI, which means that then you end up in a situation where there's a Maker CDP that has 100 Drop collateral and 100 DAI debt, right? But that's the par value. So the debt is equal to the par value of the Drop, which is that's like very risky CDP.
But as the thing, I'm not sure that's true, because you have the entire rest of the Drop pool to borrow against, right? Like, assuming like Maker isn't like the only originator, I think you can still have like a higher collateralization ratio, as long as it just means that it fixes the percentage that Maker can provide in comparison to like Drop investors, I think, unless I'm mistaken.
I'm getting an echo. what you're describing, Lev, is right. So like in this case, Maker would take exactly the same position like every other drop investor and would only have seniority over the TIN token holders, but not over any other drop token holders. They would be treated equally by all intents and purposes. That is, of course, I mean, so you called it very risky. It's as risky as anyone else buying drop from the SPV at face, or from the Tinlake pool at face value. So that's the question, right? So like, if is Maker then would we have to, how would we make sure that either that would be okay with Maker? We could say, I mean, in exchange for that, Maker obviously would be able to ask the same stability fee, like would be able to ask for a stability fee that equals the drop yield, right? So you would, yes, you would put in, Maker would have to put in 100 DAI to get 100 DAI worth of drop, but if the yield on the drop tokens were 7%, then like the entire yield would presumably go to Maker. In the second example,
am I understanding this correct? So are you saying that the collateralization ratio, that is the amount of drop compared to the amount of DAI, would be 1-to-1?
So that would be, if we were to do it this way, that would be we could do that. It would be the most, for Maker to get the same yield as all the other drop investors, it would need to be 1-to-1. If Maker was to accept a lower stability fee, then you could do what I described in the second scenario, which is you would have someone buy the drop, add and sort of use Maker to lever, right? And they would, for example, drop would yield 7%. They would deposit. It would require a 110% collateralization ratio. So I could take my 1,000 DAI, give it to Tinlake, get 1,000 DAI worth of drop, go to the CDP, pay maybe a stability fee that's slightly less, take out a DAI loan, and now we're sort of in what I called, like, Maker takes sort of a secondary position, or sort of is paying in the secondary market, at which point it would be it'd have seniority over, or it wouldn't be have seniority, but it'd have an additional insurance of course, requiring over collateralization by the vault holder. But then the vault holder couldn't directly be the Tinlake pool, because presumably then it would give Maker proportionally more drop for the same amount of DAI than for all other investors.
Yeah, I think that's really clear how you described it. I mean, since we're now discussing these two different models, it sounds like maybe, unless it turns out that one of them is obviously bad, then they need to be given like a name. And also, I think this is the sort of thing that would look really good on a like, you can make a really nice diagram for this to explain exactly how the flows work, and how Maker comes into both of them, because it's a little hard to work with these numbers in your head, but it's very clear when you say this person puts in 10 DAI, this person puts in 90 DAI, and so on. The other thing I wanted to say was that you have to, like, I guess I said earlier that like the LTV of 100% seems risky, and your point is very valid about, it's just a question of what sort of return Maker is going to get, because if if Maker is providing essentially leverage to these drop investors at like 50% LTV, then it's going to be getting a really low rate, and it's very secure, because it has you have to have a lot of losses in this loan book to actually lose 50%. But basically we can adjust that by just changing this collateral ratio, right? So you can still have, if your LTV is is 90%, you can actually still end up with the vast majority of the DAI funding for this whole deal coming from Maker ultimately. But you do now have essentially 3 tranches, so that there's these different types of participants. The last thing I just wanted to say was that while this LTV of 100 does sound risky, I think you can also introduce this notion of the TIN adjusted LTV, because here we're thinking about the LTV relative to the par value of drop, but drop has this thing built in inside of it called TIN, which means that if you adjust the V in the LTV for the TIN part, which is you're still protected by as a drop holder, as like, you know, as Maker would be in that plan A, you end up getting an LTV which is less than 100% because of TIN. So I think in order to make that clearer, I think it's worth like
yeah. So actually, I have
including this calculation.
Let me just turn on screen sharing for a second, because that is, and you had good feedback. I think we'll spend some time sort of creating an illustration of this. But yes, I mean the whole idea of TIN is that we say, well, like of course, like it's as you described, and can you see the slide I'm sharing? Like you can have the TIN. The TIN supply essentially raises the value of your drop. Like you're never able to get, so like there's a face value of the drop, which is however, like the 100 DAI that you put in, the 100 DAI and the 100 drop, like the 100 DAI drop that you get. But then, and that plus the interest rate on that is what you'll be able to redeem your drop for. But actually there's collateral that is ensuring that you can always redeem this drop for that much money that surpasses the face value of the drop. So like for the 100 DAI, you might like have this TIN supply that is actually like in addition. That is what you were describing, Lev. So
yeah, I would suggest like actually including in all of these diagrams like what the TIN adjusted LTV is and how you calculate it, just because it's, you know, it would be wrong to say that the LTV is actually 100%.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think, and so that becomes interesting, and and now we're adding a layer of complexity, but where this difference in TIN adjusted LTV and face value of the, or like DAI, like the redemption value of the drop actually does start to matter, and where we need to figure out the mechanics is when these drop token holders need to exit these drop tokens need to exit the vault, meaning a liquidation needs to happen. Because in that instance, and so this is where it gets tricky, a keeper would, if we sort of assume that these like, and that's a question, right? Like, do we want to use the exact same model to liquidate assets in MCD?
So
or
can we
yeah,
back up a second? Sorry.
Yeah.
You
Yeah,
mentioned
no,
that when drop tokens want to exit the vaults, then that triggers
Yeah.
a liquidation.
So
I don't understand why that's the case.
No, the other way around. When we need to
Right.
get rid of the collateral and have it exit the system, meaning there's a liquidation, or like there's like this, the vault needs to be closed, and it's bad debt by makers. Like MCD determines it's bad debt.
Right. So when a liquidation is triggered, what happens is what you're saying.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And so if we were to apply the model that we use for ETH, the idea is, right, that you actually get something that is worth more than, well, you get like a you have this 150% collateralization ratio. So like you're now bidding on $150 worth of ETH for 100 DAI debt. And so there's actually an opportunity for a keeper to make a profit off of this process. In this instance, however, where we're saying we have a TIN adjusted loan to value ratio of 110%, because a TIN adds this extra insurance, the redemption value of the drop token would still be 1-to-1. So that means the keeper would presumably not bid up to the drop redemption value in the auction, because that's the maximum amount they would ever get from the Tinlake pool. So if the keeper would bid on this drop that the maker vault holds, they would bid something that was slightly less. So that would result in a what is it, Sin? Lev, correct me, but bad. Basically, the system being not being able to recover everything.
Okay,
so that's yeah. Go ahead.
Okay, cool. So just to make it completely clear for me, so if, for example, someone like, you know, these loans like end finish, right, and you want to just like remove some drop from the vault and repay the debt, like that just like works fine, right? That doesn't require a
Yeah, that works fine.
Okay, that's fine. Okay, cool.
Yeah, that's all good.
Getting
right?
confused with terminology is the problem. That's all.
Yeah, no. Yeah. So keeper liquidation, keeper would not bid the outstanding debt amount, because the outstanding debt amount is what, in the best case, the keeper would be able to get from the Tinlake pool, because that's the like the redemption value, I've called it, of the drop token. So you could say that's fine, because maybe you're saying that there's 10% yield on this, or 7% yield on this drop token, and that makes up for this risk that there's going to be a small loss in the event of liquidation. That is a decision that the maker community could make. Or you would say, no, actually, that's not okay. We need to figure out how to liquidate them differently. Or we would.
It seemed.
Yeah.
That's not okay.
Yeah, it seems like one solution to that is going with the second model and just having like a higher LTV value on the maker side, right? Like if we have like 110, that means that individual actors, like presumably Centrifuge or whoever is originating the loans, right, they can still access liquidity from maker, but they can't do it like one-to-one, right? They have to put up like, say, 10% of their own like money first to get access to maker. But that would resolve, well, not resolve, but like that would minimize the keeper issue.
Yeah, you would, but you'd also cut your opportunity to make yield significantly, right? Because you're now asking to have seniority on already the senior tranche, and so I mean that's the right. I mean, it's always a trade-off of risk reward. I would actually, like Planet X said, it's not okay. Like if stability fee is being paid for these assets, and a significant amount of it, it can still be a profitable proposition for a maker, right? If you over a year pay 10% in interest, and in the case of a liquidation you have a 5% haircut on your assets, then there's a 5, like you end up with 5% up, right? So I think that's a question that I like a Centrifuge, like we don't want to answer, and I think why we're opening up this discussion. We can sort of work out both scenarios and figure out which one we want to implement.
I guess can we sort of discuss a little bit like how bad having the second model would be? Like say we have like 110%, right? Like, and then presumably Centrifuge, it still wants to source loans from the maker protocol, right? How does that?
I think because in that case you have 90% of the DAI probably from the deal that could come from maker. So
yeah,
it really doesn't end up making that much of a big difference in terms of the availability of capital.
Yeah, it means you still need some source capital, but not like still not a large amount of it.
Yeah.
So it would mean you couldn't do like build it directly into like the Tinlake contracts through the adapter, right? But you would then need like a middleman, right, or multiple middlemen.
I think it means one thing for maker, right? There's a lot more competition on the interest rate for maker, because it will lead to, like, if I have if like Centrifuge was to use maker as a say like if I was to do like anyone can do this, right? Like any actor was to do this. Like if they were to then use Maker to do this, like 9-to-1 leverage, well, if there's any cheaper source of capital available, that's where you would go.
That's, in some ways that's good for Maker though, because it means that we can adjust the stability fee and like have that die adjust to the, you know, to the requirements of monetary policy, right? Like if there's a refinance option, then like sometimes Maker can offer like cheaper rates, and sometimes it can price it out and not worry about not coming back again, if that makes sense.
So I think we have to recognize that, like, within reason, there isn't really an obvious right answer to this question, because, like, well, as Lucas just said, and obviously has been repeated many times, like if you're being adequately compensated in terms of risk reward and you've done your due diligence, meaning that the risk reward is actually correct and that, you know, the stability fee that you're charging is it's compensating you for the risk, then really any investment like makes sense, right? Like you could also be pitching us something where Maker would be making 70% per year, but it would be very risky. But, you know, obviously it would also make the system a lot of money, which it would then use as reserves to, you know, and it was properly diversified and so on and so on. So then the question is like sort of operationally and from a risk assessment point of view, like what kind of investment opportunities does the governance community want to consider, right? So I think everyone would agree that we're not going to be doing like you know, early stage venture capital with protocol with DAI minting, right? Even though, you know, in principle, philosophically, it's not impossible, but it's clearly like the wrong thing. And I think we have to look at where our strengths and weaknesses are, right? And the strengths are that that Maker has access to the lowest cost funding, pretty much. I mean, definitely in the context of DeFi, but, you know, in general has access to very low cost funding. So, like, you know, if we're talking about this kind of traditional CDP model where Maker provides, you know, has the most senior position providing leverage to drop holders, you can imagine, you know, that being at you know, at a couple of percent APY, which is, you know, kind of, you know, you would struggle to find financing at that price for this sort of thing. And, you know, and Maker is really comfortable with those really low rates, provided that it's insulated from risk. While, you know, there's really not a lot of people out there that aren't banks or stablecoin protocols that are you know, looking to invest their cash at you know, at 1% per year. Certainly not in this neck of the woods. So that's I think a reason why, you know, it's quite natural for Maker to look at these really low yielding but safe opportunities, especially if they, you know, ultimately allow pretty much just as much scale, right? Because if we're talking about this 110% collateralization ratio model, then, you know, as I said, you know, 90% of the DAI for this thing can be coming from Maker anyway. So it's not like we're, you know, locking ourselves out of a big opportunity.
Yeah, so just to mirror that, like, yeah, I agree. There's no like right or wrong answer. I'm just kind of trying to figure out in my head, like, what are the advantages and disadvantages of like both models, I guess. Oh, sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
No, go. No, I'd love to hear from. I mean, Lev, thanks for. I think you've sort of put a soft vote for sort of the second scenario, but
I also wanted to say that in principle you can't rule out any of them, because there's not like some class of things which is just like inherently wrong, right? It's all about like trade-offs and realizing where this where we think like the governance community can be the most effective.
I cut off long and maybe also will, so go ahead.
Oh, so I've got a couple of questions. So if I'm trying to kind of like get my head around the so the LTV discussion that was happening before, if I get that right from the team holders being kind of like the capital insurers in a way, what we're talking about here is kind of like is the provision model that is actually happening in the background, where those 10% is kind of like it's a capital provision for starting a new loan facility. And therefore I would say that in a normal environment, that provision would actually be adjusted to the risk of the the funding of that loan facility, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. If
so
you want to cover
fixed.
a little bit.
So like I've mentioned the TIN the TIN ratio that we want, and the drop interest rate. Both of these are things that we set and fix per TIN Lake pool, and sort of as we are figuring out. And I think that those parameters should be something that I think the maker risk team should have an input on, or at least like one thing is gonna impact the other, right? So they're fixed at first, but in the end, this is a set by us, sort of to create the most interesting product for both the borrowers and the TIN holders and maker.
But if there was a need actually to provide some sort of like recommendation in terms of what that provision should be set at, then could actually be written to the smart contract over the creation of the pool. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, it is.
Cool.
It's fixed.
Yeah. Another thing that also have in mind is, you mentioned at the very beginning, and I think also in the last week, about the short-term debt facility that would actually be creating with this pools. So two questions there. So first, how short, and at what point? How short? So what's kind of like the maturity that you're thinking initially? And second to that is, are we talking actually at a revolving type of facility where actually you can draw down and kind of like, and you can draw up? So for example, like if you had like a debt ceiling or a limit of the facility that would go up at a certain point, would you actually be able to draw up and down throughout the maturity of the facility, or are we mostly talking about just a one-off event, like a static type of facility that only drop to a certain limit?
Yeah. So we started quite simple with just a fixed term, closed-end, one-time investment, no reinvestment for debt facility, and it's sort of what we've been prototyping with. It does have disadvantages, and I like sort of take like in the spirit of like very liquid and sort of fast-moving like DeFi, we did ultimately decide that we wanted to build a revolving facility. So that means that capital can be reinvested as long as no investors want to get their capital paid out, so their shares paid out. That means the asset type is short-term credit, but again, I mean, so Centrifuge is building the technology. We're not the asset originators. We have 2 that we're working with right now, but the idea is that we bring many more that want to sort of set up like these specialized asset pools, and all of them have separate drop and TIN tokens. All of them have separate risk parameters, their own process for sort of modeling the value of these loans, setting these parameters, and then will also be individual collateral types in the maker system, right? And so I can just name as an example the maturity of Consulfreight's invoices is Consulfreight's assets. Those are 30 and 45-day invoices. So like loan maturity is somewhere between 35 and 50 days on average. And so that, but it always depends, right? And would be set per pool again, but yeah, that depends on the asset. I would, Lev, where you left off, I think would be very interesting to get a bit of a feedback from, or at least like for us would be great to be able to figure out, okay, like do we want to go with like scenario 1 we talked about, which would be makers directly injecting capital into the Tinlake pool, or is there a sort of independent actor that we would need, that would sort of act as someone creating leverage and sort of providing the 10% in additional capital to what Maker, so that Maker can have its 110% LTV. Is that how do we determine this? And I'd just like to know, maybe Long and others in sort of the community. I'm happy to create a quick write-up and publish this. But maybe there's also like feedback from others here, how to go about sort of deciding.
Yeah, I think in the end it'll probably be like a risk team decision, or like, I guess, input, a combined decision between the risk team and the community. Like, it'll be good to get like write-ups of like the different options though, right? Like, and the ways in which they're different, you know, like the trade-offs and stuff. That would be like amazing.
Yeah, I'll sort of forum thread on this. Cool. So then,
there's also this question of in this first model where you do these one-to-one CDPs, whether only the drop pool is allowed to create those, or if someone else. I'm guessing it's only even technically possible for the drop pool to create those.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it would make a lot of sense for someone else to go and create a vault to, because the thing you'd like, it shouldn't be possible to do that, because so on the Tinlake level, we make sure that all of the drop investors get treated equally when we do redemptions, right? So therefore, if Maker would accept anyone to create this vault, then what you could do is you could immediately swap your drop for DAI from Maker, and Maker would end up with drop having to redeem it itself, and so that could create these weird situation where people could arbitrage Maker, or could arbitrage this opportunity. So I think, yeah, it should be, in that case, it should only be possible for Tinlake to issue new debt directly to the vault.
Can I? Cool. That kind of ties into my next question, if I can maybe ask, which is that, okay, so all right, so the drop token pays out a certain amount, right, to its holders, right, in terms of redemption. You just mentioned they're all treated equally, which makes sense. However, if in the Maker vaults, right, we set the stability fee, and presumably we would need to set the stability fee to be. This is where I kind of get confused, because either we'd have to set the stability fee like lower than the sort of reward from like the drop tokens, or we need to set it as like the same. And like, if we set it as the same, then I don't see why anyone would want to go through Maker, because you don't get. I mean, I guess. So this is kind of, so if it's less than that amount, then where does the extra value go? Does it go just to like accrue to the drop token, to like other drop investors? Like,
yeah, so it would not make sense. It would not make sense to then modify the stability fee. I mean, you could say it would go to the TIN token holders. If the,
right.
It could go, but yeah, no, I think in that case, the way we think about stability fee for these assets is not as a lever that would be adjusted. You would, instead, the lever you would adjust is you would adjust the debt ceiling, and depending on that, you could determine how much debt should be generated from this asset.
Yeah, but I mean, we can't get rid of debt that exists with the debt ceiling, right? Like, we can't, like, unless we like force liquidate the vault, like we can't. So
that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that would be, but that could be, right. So that could be the vault manager that manages this vault on the Tinlake end would not be able to reuse it. So like you could always say that any DAI gets paid back to the vault immediately, and it would need to re-request new issuance every time it wants to reinvest. So that would be feasible to do without like changing the core of MCD. you could still sort of guarantee that Maker could use the debt ceiling as a way to manage the die created from this collateral type.
Okay, so I see how that would work. So, sorry. So in that case, the stability fee would have to track the reward or the profit from the drop token. So it'd be the same always, right? Is that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. And then we would adjust the debt ceiling, and then it would. So I guess the question there is like, like I like the users of the asset originators going to be happy with the system, which sometimes they can't use. That seems potentially bad, right? Like if it's at the debt ceiling and we reduce the debt ceiling, then it means.
I mean, you would have to sell drop tokens to someone else, right? I mean, if the users can't use the system, if the drop stability fee is higher than the than the yield on the drop, right? Like that happens no matter what, right? If you'd raise the stability fee, you could also end up in a situation where the asset originator couldn't actually use Maker to borrow.
I'm not. Yeah, I mean, assuming the stability is fixed at the amount that the drop returns, you still have the problem where the originators can't offer loans against the underlying assets because the debt ceiling isn't high enough, right? Like, isn't that going to be a problem? Like, if they want to do that?
Well, yes. I mean, then the alternative would be to sell the drop to someone else, not to put it into the vault, right? And which is
right. So my understanding was that you're going to build it, like in system 1, you're going to build it directly into the adapter. So that would be the only way of minting drop.
Oh, you mean, okay. So we would still have the so this is again like a decision we could make. We could say Maker is the only place where drop could be used, and then yes, you would end up in a situation where the asset originator would not be able to originate loans using TinLake. They could have a different TinLake deployment that had different parameters and use that. And this is actually done like in the asset originators that are more sophisticated and larger do this. They have like maybe 5 different SPVs, and talking about traditional financial world today, they have like 5 different SPVs. Like here you have bank A, B, and C as LPs, and this other one you have maybe some other investors, and depending on what you think where you want to put this loan, you put it in one or the other. So that would be one way to do it. But yeah, in the end, for this TinLake pool, if you would lower the debt ceiling, what would happen is any loans that were being repaid would immediately get the money would immediately go to.
There'd be just
Maker.
Less loans being originated than were being
exactly
repaid, right? Yeah. That makes sense. So I think. Sorry, go ahead. Yep.
Stability fee was mentioned earlier, and I just had some thoughts on that. So firstly, like obviously it wouldn't make sense for Maker in this model to decrease the stability fee to be below the yield on this, right? Because then you're just basically leaving money on the table for the pool. However, I think, and another thing that would be probably kind of evil is if Maker could at any point change the stability fee, so increase it without any warning, because potentially this thing can issue a bunch of loans, let's say at 10%, and then Maker sort of comes in and hikes the fee to 50%, right, effective immediately, and then no one would ever want to get into such a business. So you obviously you can time lock it, so you can say that you can make adjustments, but you have to put in the order a month in advance or something, which is fine. I do think you want to have this ability to adjust it, because firstly, presumably the nature of this pool will change over time, so it's not going to necessarily always be at the same yield, right? Like it'll be churning through different loans, and over time it might be changing.
This is I'm thinking the stability is going to have to like track the returns of the pool.
Right, and secondly, so if you have this time locked ability to change the stability fee, then actually, as long as there's a time lock which is reasonable for the asset originator, known in advance, then you should be able to adjust it freely, right? Because firstly, the nature of this thing can change, and secondly, the situation can change. The Maker can actually decide that this was too cheap or something, and then basically the asset originator will have some amount of time to find alternative financing, right? So if Maker increases the stability fee to a level where it doesn't make sense anymore, then they'll have to look somewhere else. So for that reason, I think firstly it makes sense to have the ability to adjust the stability fee, but just with with an appropriate like time lock, which should be like, you know, comparable to the typical maturity of the portfolio, or twice that, or something. And this also answers the thing you're talking about long about the debt ceiling. Like, what happens if you decrease the debt ceiling to try to stop this thing from issuing more debt? Well, I think that the thing should be set up in such a way that the system has the ability to get alternative financing, so that you don't destroy this whole thing. Just, you know, if Maker decides to no longer issue DAI at the right stability fee and debt.
So I think so we want the drop token yield to be as accurate as possible, obviously, because if there was a large discrepancy between how Maker priced this risk and how and what the yield was on the drop token, that would be that would mean that other drop token investors would get a bad deal. So our long-term goal is actually that there could be some conceivable way of managing what the drop return is. That does come with a whole host of governance issues that we didn't want to address in this version that we have right now. So we said we're fixing it, and what you do is you let this pool burn down and you open a new one, right? Like, if you set the drop interest rate at 10% and you've realized that actually this is like way too high, I think I can also offer this at 8%. You would open a second pool with 8%, and as long as investors were willing to invest, or if Maker was to accept this new collateral type, then you would be able to just transition, like let all of them burn down in one pool and sort of transition over to the next one. You could also come up with a way that you could adjust this drop yield, but that's sort of, we want to obviously tweak that lever instead of having Maker tweak its own, and then like our system being sort of
is it
not in sync.
Is it currently fixed then, the drop return?
Yeah,
I mean, the current version. Like, and that's fine. Like, that actually makes it easier, right? Because we can just set the stability fee to the same amount and then call it done, right?
I mean, like, I know quite well how MCD was built, and I think our team is quite familiar with sort of the architecture, and we actually have a very similar structure. So we use like the same auth pattern on our contracts. It means that we can lock down the system as much as we want, or we could also just open it up for potentially having like an address similar to like what the hat does in Maker. Sure. Set everything. But the idea for now, yeah, so I'm maybe making things too complex, but for now, first version, it will be locked down.
Not going to happen. Yeah, cool. Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I would like to jump onto that, because I think that's an important consideration that the guys have raised there was around the monitoring aspect, right? Because if you're actually opening one debt issuance, and then kind of like that, say it takes like it lasts for a month or so, and then actually the risk is different. And therefore the stability fee is priced different to that risk. So you have like a monitoring of the asset and the overall risk that actually that entity actually brings in. How I know you initially talked about the discounted cash flow and the NAV model. How do you actually see that the information around the monitoring of the payment of not only the payment of the facility, the overall risk of the underlying business actually coming through, so that actually you can make sure that actually there is actually invoices. For example, in the case of Consulfrite, they're actually about to do for payment, and the receivables actually are increasing in value. So it's a whole monitoring piece of the loan facility that would be interesting to have a little bit of insight from you.
So I mentioned we created, and I mean, we're sort of have to trade off what we would want to have in the ideal world with what is feasible sort of doing on chain on Ethereum. But we wanted, like, one of our design goals was to say that this entire thing can exist on chain, because we want to be able to give that transparency to everyone. And we want to make sure that these cash flows between different loans and different investors are enforced on chain. We could also, I mean, many sort of security token projects just say, we're going to mint this ERC20 token. There's like one admin that mints them, and we're going to provide a bunch of PDF documents that say, here's why this token now should be worth something, and that's it. And the structure that we build is a lot more complicated, but it has this advantage that you can rely on the cash flows. However, it still needs, obviously, an oracle that tells it that an NFT that is an individual loan, an individual asset, is actually worth that much. And so the NAV model and so when we add an asset to a Tinlake pool, we rely on an oracle to provide us a risk class. And so that needs to be determined depending on the different like types of loans. Each pool would have its own oracle to determine a risk score for these assets. The risk score would then internally give this individual loan an interest rate and an advance rate, right? So on our side, on the borrower in this loan portfolio, right, we have the same. We can have the same thing that Maker also has. We have a loan to value ratio and an interest rate or a stability fee. So we call it loan to value ratio and interest rate. So we set that, and then the same information is used. So that this risk score and the value that is fed by these oracles is then also used to calculate the NAV of the entire portfolio. And so this would be information that was going to be fed into the system by oracles. And so it could be and our goal is to have, of course, redundancy, different data sources, and that would be part of the sort of due diligence process to get these assets on, is like working out what these data sources should be and how we come up with this risk matrix that determines the different interest rates, the NAV model, and so on.
Cool. Yeah, my question was more around the actual oracle feeding raw information rather than the, I would say, like the secondary information, which is actually the derived risk models itself.
So what do you mean, like where the actual oracle, meaning like what entity is going to give?
Yeah, so for example, the oracle providing the data on the ongoing receivables, that is effectively the underlying collateral. In the case, for example, of Consulfrite, where you can actually see for that pool, what is the combination of the value of that portfolio that is actually being put as collateral, and how the receivables, the combination of the receivables is increasing or decreasing in value, because that actually then can be effectively priced or risk assessed over time. And therefore, if there is differences in the cash flow that can be forecasted, then you can properly price the deal at the end of the day, right? On an ongoing basis. That's why I find the monitoring piece is quite an important one.
Yeah, no, it obviously is. I can. So what I can say about this is that, like, obviously the data will be different for example, between Paperchain and Consulfrite, and it will be, and sort of like we're working on providing like a clear description of how exactly this process will look like. There will be like one aspect will be someone will have to, so what we call provenance, will have to confirm that the asset actually, there is a legal claim in the SPV that sort of runs this entire thing on the asset. There will be credit rating of the individual borrowers to determine the default risk. And then things like fraud scoring, sort of cluster risk, and things that we will have individual different counterparties provide in as data sources. And so that will come on chain on an asset, so NFT by NFT level, from that we derive the NAV on chain. I will sort of post some information on that on our forum application, on the application thread, as we have some more stuff there.
Sure.
I also want to be yeah, I want to maybe we set this call for an hour. It is super interesting discussion. We're a little over. I would say let's end it. I'm sure a lot of people will have stuff to do. Maybe just like sort of last couple of minutes of questions, and we'll do this again whenever people want. I can take the conversation also to the forum. But yeah, and I'll follow up with the sort of the materials we discussed.
Yeah, I think this diagram with like diagrams and numbers, worked example, but also with the formulas so that people understand what the TIN adjusted LTV is and stuff would be really useful. And also, I think we should be open to the possibility of using both models actually, which is to have Maker provide capital both through the first and second option.
Yeah.
With appropriate debt ceilings and stability fees. Yeah,
actually, that's interesting. It's a good idea. I mean, the second model is presumably much easier to implement. It just follows fairly similar to what we have. The first one will be like some custom built stuff. But yeah. Okay. Does anyone else have any questions or things we need to address? Otherwise, I would propose we do another call like that in 2 weeks. Great, then thanks everyone for attending. We'll post a recording of this and some more updates online. Cool. Good, have a good one. Bye.
Thanks, man. Thanks, man. Cheers.
Yeah, thank
cool.
you.
Yep.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.